Today's episode is brought to you by the Daily Gardener Friday newsletter. You can sign up for the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. Hi there and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about garden history and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is May 26th. Today in garden history, we celebrate the birthday of Sébastien Vaillant, the French botanist. He was born on this day, May 26th in 1669. Appointed to the King's Garden in Paris, Sébastien loved organizing and cataloging plants. Biographical accounts say that Sébastien showed a passion for plants from the age of 5. His masterpiece, 40 Years in the Making, called Botanicon Parisienne, was a book about the flora of Paris. It wasn't published until 5 years after his death. Sébastien's work on plant sexuality inspired generations of botanists, and it set the stage for Linnaeus to develop his sexual system of plant classification. Linnaeus used male stamens to determine the class and the female pistils to determine the order. And like Sébastien, Linnaeus often compared plant sexuality to that of humans. Linnaeus wrote, "Love even seizes plants, both males and females." On June 10th, 1717, Sébastien caused a sensation at the Royal Garden in Paris. On that day, he presented a lecture titled Lecture on the Structure of Flowers, Their Differences, and the Use of Their Parts. Sébastien began by reinforcing the idea that the flower is the most important part of the plant, essential to reproduction, and then he began to lead his scientific colleagues into a deep dive on plant sexuality at 6 a.m, no less. Before Sébastien's lecture, the topic of sex in the plant world had only been touched on lightly, allowing flowers and blossoms to maintain their reputations as pure and sweet and innocent. Today, we can imagine the reaction of Sébastien's 600-person audience as he began using fairly explicit language and the lens of human sexuality to describe the sex lives of plants. In 2002, a translation of Sébastien's speech was presented in the Huntia, a journal of botanical history, and they reported that Sébastien started his lecture with these words. Perhaps the language I'm going to use for this purpose will seem a little novel for botany, but since it will be filled with terminology that is perfectly proper for the use of the parts I intend to expose, I believe it will be more comprehensible than the old-fashioned terminology, which, being crammed with incorrect and ambiguous terms, is better suited for confusing the subject than for shedding light on it. And that sounds about right. Well, Sébastien's discussion of plant embryos was rather poetic. I thought you would enjoy this. He said, "Who can imagine that a prism with 4 faces becomes a pansy, a narrow roll, the borage, a kidney, the daffodil, that a cross can metamorphose into a maple, that 2 crystal balls intimately glued together, comfrey. These are nevertheless the shapes that are favored in these diverse plants by their lowly little embryos." So sweet. And it was on this day, May 26th, in 1742, that Horace Walpole wrote to Horace Mann, in part describing his visit to Ranelagh Gardens in Chelsea. Ranelagh had just opened 2 days prior, and it was one of several pleasure gardens that had opened around this time period in the mid-1700s. Here's what Horace wrote. Today calls itself May 26th, as you perceive by the date, but I am writing to you by the fireside instead of going to Vauxhall. If we have one warm day in 7, quote, we bless our stars and think it a luxury. And yet we have as much waterworks and fresco diversions as if we lay 10 degrees nearer warmth. 2 nights ago, Ranelagh Gardens were opened at Chelsea. The prince, princess, duke, much nobility, and much mob besides were there. There is a vast amphitheater, finely gilt, painted, and illuminated, into which everybody that loves eating, drinking, staring, or crowding is admitted for 12 pence. The building and gardens cost £16,000. Twice a week, there are to be redatos, or entertainment, for which you are to have supper and music. I was there last night, but did not find the joy of it. Vauxhall is a little better, the garden is pleasanter, and you arrive by water. So there you go, Horace's initial impressions of Ranelagh Gardens. But he must have come to prefer Ranelagh because he later wrote, "It is totally beat Vauxhall. You can't set your foot without treading on a prince or Duke of Cumberland." It was Horace Walpole who wrote, "When people will not weed their own minds, they are apt to be overrun by nettles." And it was on this day, May 26th, in 1811, that Thomas Jefferson wrote to his granddaughter Anne, who was visiting her in-laws. Thomas wrote, "Nothing new has happened in our neighborhood since you left us. The houses and trees stand where they did. The flowers come forth like the bells of the day, have their short reign of beauty and splendor. The hyacinths and tulips are off the stage. The irises are giving place to the belladonnas, as they will to the tuberoses," and so on. Well, Thomas Jefferson was not able to garden much during the summer of 1811. His arthritis had flared, and he found himself mostly bedridden, which is probably why he had time to write his granddaughter Anne. And it was on this day, May 26th in 1921, that Kate Lancaster Brewster resigned as the editor of the bulletin that she funded and started for the Garden Club of America for its first 6 years. At the time of her resignation, Kate reported that the cost of publishing the bulletin, including postage between July of 1920 and May of 1921, totaled over $4,000. The number of paid subscribers was 55, and the number of lapsed subscribers was 21. 2 paid subscribers became members at large, and 1 paid subscriber had become a member of the Garden Club of America. So those stats were not very good. But as for Kate Lancaster Brewster, she had a beautiful Italianate garden in upscale Lake Forest, Illinois. The estate was absolutely gorgeous, and she was friends with some of the most prominent gardeners and garden writers of her time, including Mrs. Frances King, otherwise known as Louisa Yeomans King. And when Louisa published the Little Gardens series, Kate ended up writing one of the books for it, and it was called The Little Garden for Little Money. And this was likely a topic that was a little foreign to Kate. She and her husband Walter were serious art collectors, and they loved to travel. The couple helped establish the Chicago Art Institute, and during World War I, Kate left her service work in Chicago, California, and New York, and she went to France. And so she resigned her position with the Garden Club of America and publishing their bulletin, and she went to assist her friend, the indefatigable Mabel Boardman of the American Red Cross, and together they did hospital work. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, The Thoughtful Gardener by Jenny Blom. This book came out in 2017, and the subtitle is An Intelligent Approach to Garden Design. Well, Pete Outolf has high praise for Jenny Blom. He writes, "The most romantic, creative person in garden design that I know." So that's high praise right there from one of our top modern garden designers. Well, like Pete Outolf, Jenny Blom is a force all her own. She's designed well over 200 gardens, and they represent a diverse range of garden styles, proving that Jenny Blom really is the thoughtful gardener. Now, one of Jenny's superpowers is to take a look at the current landscape, to look at the setting, and then determine what vision best fits that landscape. And of course, into all of that, she has to throw client desires and other challenges that might come up in the creation of that garden. Whether it's topography challenges or resource issues, Jenny has truly seen it all. And through her experiences, she's come up with 6 different steps to help you become a thoughtful gardener too. Now, I think one of the things that Jenny does almost unconsciously now is that she really thinks through what it is that she's trying to accomplish in any given landscape. And I don't care what it is you're trying to accomplish, you will definitely do a better job of reaching your anticipated goals if you take the time to do your homework and to truly think things through. So the 6 different sections that are in Jenny's book are understanding, structuring, harmonizing, rooting, and liberating. And Jenny also has another superpower that I think really helps her when it comes to her garden design skills. And that is that she has the ability to see gardens as they will look when they are mature. And that's a special skill for garden designers. I remember the first time that I interviewed the Renegade Gardener, and he said the same thing to me. He said that he was a successful garden designer because he could imagine what a plant would look like at maturity or in any particular setting. And so he knew what to plant where and how it would look when it was all grown up. And so his goal was not to make sure that the garden would look good immediately, although that was a temporary concern and a nice to have. He was more concerned, his ultimate goal was to be able to drive by these properties that he had designed, especially early in his career, and see their mature beauty in the fullness of time. And so Jenny also has that ability. Now, Paula Dietz, the editor of the Hudson Review, wrote the foreword to Jenny's book, and here's what she said. Rare is the garden book like this one that makes the reader feel personally included as a friend in a long conversation with the writer. Like Lancelot Capability Brown, whom Jenny lauds for his estate management in the 18th century, Jenny Blom is herself a cultural geographer who sculpts out the historical features of paths and gates and antiquated farm buildings on a given property prior to drawing up a plan that proceeds almost instantaneously, a process that's fascinating to follow, whether in town or the country, whether either single or multiple garden areas. Jenny establishes architectural enclosures like Cotswold dry stone walls prior to the overlay of her signature, beautifying horticulture, thus creating what she calls environments for intimate experiences. And that is the quintessential Jenny Blom landscape. Now, this is how Jenny herself describes this book. She writes, "So this book is about how I've developed my way of working over the last 20 years and my progression from apprentice to journeyman to master craftsman. And I've learned at the elbow of countless masters, not in a schoolroom. I choose plants with compatibility in mind. Appropriate materials arise from their locale, and I consider the people who will live in the garden, the wildlife, the weather. I'd like to share some of what I think about when designing in the hope that it kindles the fires of excitement in others. I've climbed a big mountain to get to this point and hope there's a view worth sharing. Well, I can tell you that from the reviews of this book, from the Amazon ratings, and from the commentary by her peers, that Jenny Blum definitely has a view worth sharing. She's hit it out of the park, out of the garden, with this beautiful book called The Thoughtful Gardener. You'll get to see images from so many of Jenny's gardens. You'll see her thoughtfulness and creativity in action. But most of all, you'll get to know Jenny. She is funny and smart, and she thinks about plants and gardens and landscapes on a level that very few garden designers do. It feels like she's always one step ahead, and I think that's because Jenny does such a thorough job researching and thinking about her garden designs, so that by the time you see the final product, it just seems so effortless. But I suppose that is, at the end of the day, Jenny's method behind the madness. This book is 256 pages of learning garden design with one of our modern masters, Jenny Blum. You can get a copy of The Thoughtful Gardener by Jenny Blum and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $16, and that's a steal. Finally, we end the show today with a botanic spark that celebrates the American poet Edgar Fawcett. Edgar was born on this day, May 26th, back in 1847. Edgar wrote some very popular garden verses. He wrote, "All life budding like a rose, and sparkling like its dew." He also wrote, "Come rambling a while through this exquisite weather of days that are fleet to pass, when the stem of the willow shoots out a green feather and buttercups burn in the grass." Well, Edgar's poems often remind us of the value of all green living things. He wrote, "We say of the oak, how grand of girth, of the willow we say, how slender, and yet to the soft grass clothing the earth, how slight is the praise we render." Well, my favorite Edgar Fawcett verses often feature trees. And so I thought I'd end the show today with this adorable little verse. It's about lovers, and they're speaking to each other beneath a canopy of trees, and they're using the language of birds to say how they feel. "Hark, love, while we walk beneath melodious trees. You'd speak to me in redbreast. I would answer you in wren." Well, that's it for today's show. Thank you so much for listening to The Daily Gardener. I hope you have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. I hope you get to spend some time in the garden. I plan on installing my mini orchard up at the cabin, so I'll have 5 apple trees firmly planted in the ground by Monday. And speaking of Monday, no show on the holiday, but episodes will resume on Tuesday. And just a reminder that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. The next time you're over at Facebook, just search for Daily Gardener Community, where you'd search for a friend and then request to join. And if you'd like more of The Daily Gardener, you can subscribe to the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. And don't forget that you can also show your support for the show by using the Buy Me a Coffee link over at the website or in today's show notes. This is Jennifer Ebling. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day.